I hope you are fans of trilogies, because today we have the final episode on the trilogy of Blizzard announcements towards changing healing. Their announcement is saying they are making some significant changes by increasing once more the health pool of players, because they intend to shift some of the challenging moments from being overwhelming bursty damage windows to instead being more sustained healing profiles. Now, you're not having a placebo effect. This actually happened before. It happened at the beginning of Dragonflight, where HP was increased without increasing the power of the heals, and then midway through Dragonflight, HP was increased again without increasing the power of the heals, and now at the beginning of the War Within we have more increase to HP bars without once again increasing the power of the heals. The logic of Blizzard is that because healing is so powerful that can top players in a couple of globals, the only way for us to make things dangerous is if boss mechanics are in one-shot territory within a couple of globals, because that's how powerful healers are. So if we keep stretching the health bars more and more, we can make the damage come in the larger health bar more slowly, which can give the healers more time to heal players up, so we can now make the damage, the dangerous damage windows of a boss be, 10 seconds long, instead of being 3 seconds long. So big bursty heals become less valuable, and more consistent healing becomes more valuable. That should be the theory, at least. Now, the reason why some players are a bit skeptical is because this is the same thing that was said at the beginning of Dragonflight, and it didn't work. We got into the Season 1 of Dragonflight and Mythic Plus was a nightmare, one-shots everywhere, boss mechanics doing ridiculous damage, players being floor POV non-stop, the raid encounters weren't much better. In Vault of the Incarnates you had bosses like Kurog in their Earth phase, but also its Fire phase, doing very heavy one-shot-esque type of damage. Then you had Diurna with her staff breaking, also doing practically one-shot tier damage, and then you get into Razaget and the charge is exploding in P1, for example, also one-shot category. This carried on in Aberrus, things didn't get any better, still plenty of one-shot windows in that raid, from Rashok, one-shots and very high windows of damage. Neltarion infamously having both the hearts exploding, the big AoE of Neltarion, and even the last phase damage, very very heavy, and then Sarkaret as well with a very very high damage P1. They add the extra once more extension of our health bars before Amir Drasil, and we still ended up roughly in a situation where most of the power of your healing had to be concentrated into a few small windows with high burst healing requirements. So now we are at the third attempt of this working. This is of course quite necessary, for all the players who didn't really get to play Shadowlands, even the early on versions, fights like Stone Legion, fights like Sludge Fist, these fights were much more smooth and had a much lower burst requirements of damage, even further into Sepulcher. For the many problems of Sepulcher and the difficulty of the Sepulcher bosses, Anduin and Rygelon and the Jailer had a much smoother damage profile with much fewer one-shot instances and power put into super strong cooldowns. And you might be even misled, right? You might be running through these images and go like, hold on a second, this Sludge Fist damage taken to me reads exactly the same as Smolderon, Where's the difference between the damage taken on Smolderon and the damage taken on Sludge Fist? Well, you would have to see and remember the actual fights to know that these burst windows weren't even that close to being one-shot territory compared to some of the newer fights in Dragonflight, for example. The clip you have been seeing now is a clip of Rygelon. And by looking at this, you would be thinking that this was some insane burst damage windows with super high damage, but as you can see, it's really not. It's just consistent damage taken. It's what we call rot damage. It's lasting for 20 plus 30 second windows. It's not a 2 globals to stay alive type of mechanic. Just to name a single example, Farak. Everyone who progressed Farak knows very well about the lovely mechanic called Blaze. Before Blaze was nerfed about 50 times, Blaze was practically a one-shot if you were hit by 2 of them at the same time. And sometimes Even if you got hit by a single one, it was being overlapped with other mechanics that together would form a one-shot. So even if, when you zoom out, the overall damage of Ferak in P1 looks kind of consistent, it wasn't even that, because in its spike of certain particular mechanics, it would still create one-shot instances, which was not nearly as much the case in older fights, in older mechanics. Now, some of you might be saying, but getting one shot is good, because if you fail a certain mechanic, then you deserve to die, right? Why should you stay alive if you get run over by the beams of Tindral? Well, besides the fact that the fight brought you down to 5 FPS, those are the type of mechanics you should be one-shot by. The problem, though, aren't those one-shots right now. The problem are normal mechanics one-shotting you. Take Rashok, for example. Even if you did dodge the lava waves of Rashok, you could still get happily one-shot doing the slam of Rashok, plus the absorb shield, the health absorb shield put on you, plus the clearing of the debuff on Rashok, happening within 5 or so seconds. That was the period of super high damage, causing multiple deaths in a very narrow window. And in those narrow window, there is no big brain thinking that a healer can do. In that window, you just have to dump all of your AoE buttons or your cooldowns and hope it's enough to keep people alive in 4 to 5 seconds, and hope that the squishier ones, the ones that are more at risk of dying, have the awareness to use some kind of defensive, because at that point it's out of your hands. That's where it feels more unfair to be dying. I am doing this mechanic correctly, I have dodged the lava waves correctly, I even use my defensive correctly, but because I am a balance druid, I am squishy, and this mechanic has a ridiculous burst damage in 4 seconds, I still die. That's the type of mechanic that gets players, in particular healers, pretty sad. Because there is this heavy pressure to heal players super quickly within a few seconds, and very often you feel starved of GCDs, because everything is happening in 5 seconds. And as a healer, you would like to press 7 or 8 buttons in that window, but you simply don't have the time. You have to try to make do with the few seconds you have to try to keep players alive. Like maybe as an evoker, you want to finish your temporal anomaly into your dream breath, then into a full channel of spirit bloom, then perhaps into a dream breath, but that's already like 6 or 7 seconds. 2 or 3 people might have already died in those 7 seconds. That's too long of a time, too long of a window. So it also does get you this stressful feeling as a healer where you don't have nearly enough time to get people to be topped, which is not the case and wasn't the case, for example, in Shadowlands. Shadowlands topping players was much slower because you had way more rot damage other than instead of burst damage, so the value on topping players in HP was very high. So it wasn't happening very often, or very quickly rather. You had lots of consistent damage, which requires healers to constantly have, consistent healing rather than having to survive a particular single hit, which made the healing overall much more smooth compared to the newer version of bosses from Dragonflight, the first tier already involved, all the way down to the last bosses we have gotten in Amirdrasil. Now this is of course also a problem in Mythic Plus, right? Because in Mythic Plus you go down from having 4 or even 5 healers to having only 1. So technically you now have you should have a massive amount of agency on the healer, right? The healer is the one that saves people now in your Mythic Plus group. The problem, which is making healers more and more discouraged from getting into Mythic Plus, is that this has not even been the case. Because the moment you start reaching high enough Mythic Plus key levels, mechanics will start hurting so much that you cannot survive without DPS help. The knowledge as a healer that as you're about to fight this boss, you won't kill this boss if the DPS cannot use his healthstone and his 3 different defensives properly, because your power alone is not enough, gets kind of depressing. Even in fights that players think about or thought about being HPS checks. And a great test of a healer's skill, like Halls of Infusion's 3rd boss. That would be the perfect way to out casuals, because you would know, anyone who pushed high enough Halls of Infusion keys, that after a certain point a healer cannot heal the Halls of Infusion 3rd boss if the DPS players don't use their defenses properly, because the healer's power alone is not enough. And even then, that's one of the best cases for healers, because the damage on that boss is still consistent. It's rot damage, it's not burst. It gets even worse when you look at burst instances of damage, because again, as you keep climbing Mythic Plus keys, you reach a level where the healer becomes completely useless, because the ability cast by the boss or by the trash mob is a one-shot. So you, as a healer, cannot do anything. You have no power to stop that one-shot with your healing power alone. You're now completely in the hands of either crowd control or defensives from the DPS player, or in the rare case, your own external, happening once every few minutes. And this is, again, a very, disheartening moment for a healer, because you would be entering a mode where you are supposed to be doing a certain thing, which is healing, and in the hardest moments, in the toughest parts of a fight, that doesn't even matter, because surviving doesn't even get to be up to you anymore. It's gonna be up to the defensive power of the other specs. And it is hard for DPS players to fall behind this feeling, because they never quite felt it themselves. The only way to make them realize this is to go into a mythic raid boss and constantly fail DPS checks, because the healers are not doing enough damage. Right now, you have billions of DPS players tinkering around with raid bots and with simulation craft, trying to min-max their damage to the last percentile, only to realize it's all useless because one of the healers is not even clicking DPS buttons, so you continuously fail DPS checks. That is kind of how it feels to heal as a healer when you know certain mechanics are going to be one-shots and outside of your control, unless the DPS player does something about it with its own power. If that were the case, we would see practically a revolt. We would have, within minutes, pitchforks and fires down the Blizzard's HQ, demanding for a change and demanding to make DPS the only DPS valuable in a raid. Unfortunately, that's not really been the case when it comes to healing. Healing is now super bursty, is concentrated into very short windows, making your burst abilities the most important thing in your toolkit, as well as still a lot of power being put into the defensives of each other spec. Now, again, for the third time, Blizzard is attempting to fix this, and again with the exact same solution. Just stretch the health bars, forehead. With the help of my paint skills, the solution that Blizzard has in mind is very simple. If this is 100% of your HP, Blizzard's idea is very simple. Right now, bosses and mechanics do 100% of your HP in something like 1 or 2 or 3 hits. So you have healers with something like 2 or 3 GCDs worth of time to save you from dying. So Blizzard's logic is, okay, so what if we just largely increase the HP of players, make the damage become way more fragmented over time, but leave the healing power the same. So the healing power previously was up to here in only something like 2 or 3 GCDs, right? Now though, you take much more damage with a much larger health pool, which means healers now have a longer time to be able to heal you. So the burst damage and the power of being able to have tons of healing in a few GCDs becomes less relevant. And now longer and more consistent healing becomes more valuable. The problem isn't really in this explanation, because logically this would make sense. The problem is that this has been mentioned 3 times already. This is the 3rd time we are hearing of this from Blizzard, and it has failed horribly the first 2 times already. Increasing the max HP of players did nothing at the beginning of Dragonflight, and it did nothing halfway through Dragonflight. The problems were still the same. Mythic Plus mechanics were still one-shotting players, and only the tankier players will be able to make it into the meta of Mythic Plus. In raids, the most important moments for healers were short, quick windows of heavy burst healing required in just a few seconds or few windows of healing requirements, and outside of those windows, the damage done and the healing requirements was much lower. So now we find ourselves on, take number 3 of this attempt at changing the healing style in both Mythic Plus and the raid. So we have for now down on lock what is the actual current problem when it comes to healing. Too much burst damage, The burst damage makes it way more stressful and also way more one-dimensional to heal, because it's always only clumping all of your strongest heals into 4 to 5 seconds, 4 to 5 GCDs, and then sort of chill until the next window of heavy damage. A lot of the times this becomes more frustrating because even just your heals won't be enough. You have to start relying on player defensives and externals and damage reduction tools because of how spiky the damage is. And in Mythic Plus it gets even worse because you don't even have the help of other healers, it's just you, so the one-shot mechanics are more prominent, it's much harder to stay alive, consistent healing and rot damage are even rarer in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. So we have highlighted and pinpointed the actual issue right now for healing. Now we have the announcement of Blizzard and their plans to change it. So we will see again if third time's the charm with this proposed change from Blizzard, after seeing in action this proposed change twice, having no effect on the state of healers in the game. So now we get to see again if this will have any effect in the power and the style of healing in the expansion. So hoping we get to see a better outcome than the first 2 times this was attempted. I guess all there is left to see is just wait how well this will be implemented in the game. Besides this though, I am going to leave you all to the rest of your Thursday. Also, as a reminder, raid test day in the beta of The War Within. Now, thanks of course as usual for having watched the video, as well as any other ways to support for free, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, now I just heard back from my team of analysts. At the moment, my hopium meter for these healing changes is at 14.6%. So, not looking good.